She's coming directly from Munich in Germany, and I'm talking about Dr. Bettina von Stamm, who is with us today to share her wisdom and expertise on the core competency for thriving in the 21st century. I'm not going to tell you what that competency is. She is going to be telling you about that. Let me tell you about a little bit about Bettina's and her fantastic background. She's an author of several books. She has been a visionary thinker and doer in the field of innovation for nearly 30 years, whether running leadership seminars and workshops or speaking at conferences, whether coaching, mentoring, or teaching MBAs and executives. Bettina brings her contagious positive energy to bear to inspire and open minds. She also shared that she's a firm believer that in today's world of sustainability considerations, need to be a key consideration in all innovation activities. As a global leader of excellence and innovation, it gives me great pleasure to learn and share with leaders like you, Bettina. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with our global audience today.
Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, Jose. And now let me get my presentation started. And I shall share my screen and off I go. And I apologize, my internet is slightly on the slow side, but I will get there in a moment. I keep clicking on the button and now I think we are off. I hope that everyone can see my screen, and now the secret is revealed. I firmly believe that resilience is the key competency for thriving in the 21st century. And it's not only me who thinks that. It seems, as when you look at the literature, there is, whether it is the academics or the public journals or the consultant companies, all of them have been starting to talk about resilience in their publications. Now, I think the first thing to do is probably to look at what is actually resilience. What does it actually mean? And resilience is not about not getting into trouble, not experiencing adversity. Resilience is when you fall down to be able to get up again quickly, or as the proper definition goes, is the ability to adapt well in the face of adversity. And I think we all agree we had adversity aplenty. If you go back some years to 2008, when we had the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which triggered a global economic crisis, whether you think back to 2010, when a volcano erupted in a country that probably many people had never heard of before, Iceland, yet again, it had a global impact on the travel and aviation industries. And of course, most recently, the experience of the coronavirus, which we've been grappling with for almost 2 years. So plenty of adversity. Maybe that's already enough to answer why resilience is important today, but I'd like to dig a little bit deeper and say, really, why is it particularly critical today? And I'd like to look at two aspects. The first of which is the context of the 21st century. What is it that is so different about this particular context in which we operate? And I've identified 5 changes. And the first is that the pace of change is accelerating. We probably had all had a sense that that is so. So I was particularly pleased when I found a piece of research by a colleague of mine, Nico Blensky, who indeed investigated the rate at which change has been introduced over the years. And this is what he found. He looked at almost 4,000 years of history, and he can see a number of different areas, from military technology to human awareness to leadership assumptions, that all seem to have developed quite nicely over the 4,000 years. And then something happened around the turn of the millennium that meant that the rate at which change is being introduced accelerated exponentially. And I think it's probably not too difficult to discern that it was the internet that triggered this acceleration of the rate at which change is being introduced. And if you look at the proliferation of the internet, you can see that it is around the year 2000 that it really has grown exponentially in many parts of the globe. The second change compared to last century that I'd like to talk about is connected to this, and that is the increased degree of connectivity. So what does it actually mean that we have such connectivity? Well, the first thing is that it leads to an increased access to information. If you just think about whatever you're looking for, you go on to whichever search engine you are using, you type in your question, and within seconds, you have got reams and reams of pages providing you with information. Yet if you think, 20 years or so ago, when I did my PhD at London Business School from 94 to 98, I didn't have this wonderful tool called the internet. I had to go do it the old-fashioned way and go into the library, where I would sit day in, day out. And if I wanted a piece of information, I had to very often order it in, and then it would take days or weeks or sometimes even months for me to be able to access that piece of information. So it is absolutely wonderful that we have access to information so easily. And one of the reasons it's so wonderful, I believe, is that it increases transparency. It is very difficult now for organizations to hide things, be they good or bad. And it's very easy for us to find out what the board of an organization is, who the shareholders are, if it's a publicly listed company. All of these things that would have taken a lot of time and research to find out are easily within reach. So that's absolutely brilliant, because I also believe that the increased transparency leads to an increased awareness. And what do I actually mean by that? What I mean by that is, if, again, say sort of 15, 20 years ago, I would have gone to the shop at Christmas time and found strawberries, I would have been utterly delighted because I really like strawberries. Whereas if I go into the shop today, I still see the strawberries and I wonder, what is the ecological footprint of getting these strawberries to me into the shop around Christmas time? And I can make an educated choice. I can make an educated decision about what I want to do. So the access of information has enabled us to become much more aware, make much more deliberate and conscious choices. There's also a second aspect to the connectivity, and that is the increase in speed. And I always wonder how many of you have received an email in the morning which you haven't had a chance to answer, and then you already get another one in the afternoon saying, you haven't replied yet, have you not received my email? Everything is expected to happen in an instant. Yet what happens if we have to make decisions so quickly in the spur of the moment? Despite the fact that all the information is out there somewhere, very often when we need to make a decision, we have incomplete information. And the other thing I mentioned, when you type in a search word, a search term, a search phrase, you generally get pages and pages and pages of information. And how do we know what is real? How do we know what has a solid foundation or what is fake news? And I think we all have become much more aware how easy it is to disseminate fake news. So despite so much information being out there and information creating transparency and making us more aware, very often we struggle with the incompleteness of information and just information overload, sheer confusion. There's a third change, which I call convergence. And if you just think, I assume that most of you will probably have a smartphone. And if you just think about, if you would have to replace your smartphone with all the functionality that's on it, what are all the things that you would need? You would probably need a television, a radio, a cinema, your address book, an atlas. You probably even got people inside your phone, like some doctor's advice or some investment advice. And so these boundaries that existed between the different industries, between the different specialities, seem to have evaporated. And that is true not only for products, it is also true for the service industry. For example, in the UK, when you go to the supermarket, you can as easily buy your insurance and banking products as you can buy milk and butter. And not only that, also in the entertainment industry, we are seeing a significant overlap. I, for one, do not have a television. I've just got my iPad on which I watch movies. And I hardly ever go in the cinema as well, certainly not in the last year and a half. So there is convergence in many industries, and not only industries and products, it's also in manufacturing. And if you think about the possibilities that arise with 3D printing, where you nowadays you even 3D print houses, there are some amazing projects going on. But what does it mean? You know, all the industries that were all separate, boundaries disappear. And I think it's a bit of a challenge because our brain likes to put things in boxes. So we don't have to figure out what everything is each time we encounter something. So we're a little bit confused by this dispersion of boundaries. And then I think there's a final one, which has changed significantly, even more so through COVID, where we have not really been aware of what was going on until fairly recently. And that is the disappearance of the boundary between our professional and personal lives. And again, as already said, Corona has accelerated that even more. But just think about, you know, with your smartphone, with your email, with your iPad, with your other you know, I use all the I words, but with your tablets, you know, who of you does not reply to business-related things after business hours, or in the holidays, or over the weekend? I know that I certainly do, not least because the thought of coming back to an inbox that is so full that I need to deal the next week just dealing with it is much worse than answering a few emails during my holiday. Yet it was not my choice. And now it has become such established practice that it is very difficult. It takes a lot of courage to say, well, I do delete all the emails that come in during my holiday. So convergence, in my view, has had a big impact on our lives, and not only on our professional, but also on our personal lives. And then there's another change compared to the last century, and that is actually, that's us, that's we. What we expect, what we anticipate, what's important to us has changed over the years. And I found a framework that, while developed in the context of identifying what kind of operational competencies were required, I think it also really demonstrates quite well the differences, the changes in what impacts our purchasing decision. And so if you go back to the middle of the last century, after the world wars, certainly in Europe and probably also in the US, all of us, the customers were just delighted that the shelves started to fill up again after they were empty, had been empty for such a long time. So it was almost, as long as the companies got things into the shop, it was okay. But soon that was no longer enough. And then we said, well, we'd like to have stuff, yes, and we would also like it to last, not fall apart at the earliest opportunity. And so this is when the quality movement took hold. And another decade or so later, it was not enough to have stuff that lasts. It had to be a little bit more. It had to be about us. We wanted to have an influence over the things that we were buying. And that was sort of the decade where mass customization started to take off. And then another couple of decades or so later, it was no longer enough to have stuff that lasts and that's a little bit about us. It had to be more than that. It had to be an experience. And that was the rise of the brands. And if you think about what that actually means, a question, I so love to be in the same room with you, but I can't. So I'll just share the experience I have when asking these questions in face-to-face situations. Here I ask, have you ever been to a Starbucks? Have you ever had a Starbucks coffee? The answer to that question, generally, almost every hand goes up. Of course, depending on the geography, but the geographies where I present, generally every hand goes up. Then I ask the question, do you think that Starbucks is the nicest coffee that you've ever had? And I have to admit that hardly any hands go up. So it is clearly not the coffee that people go to for Starbucks. but it is Starbucks were the first one to offer a home away from home and office away from the office, where you could sit with your computer, listen to pleasant music with 1 cup of coffee without being disturbed by waiters every 5 minutes, reminding you to purchase something else. And so I also always like to ask the question, so what's next? What's next on the agenda? And here there is a very interesting polarization. If the audience is predominantly grey-suited, grey-haired, there is a struggle to identify what might be next, often coming with cost, convenience. Yet when I have an audience that is 30 years or younger, it will not take a couple of seconds before environmental and social considerations are being mentioned. And I think that is really, really important, not least because of all the challenges that we as humanity are facing. If you just think about all the stuff that is going on, not least, again, COVID, and we really need to find a way of dealing with it. And the problems are only going to get worse. Some of you might be familiar with this graph by the WWF, which they started about 10, 15 years ago, where they look at the Human Development Index, or rather the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, and map that against the footprint of a country. So all those blobs on the chart are countries, representing countries. And so you might guess that the big yellow blobs are China and India. And if you see the biggest red one, which is which has got quite big feet, i.e. consuming quite a lot of resources, that is the United States. And back when this chart was created, it was already clear that if everyone wanted to live and consume like the United States, because the trend is only ever going one way, then we would need 4 planets Earth by 2020, and that was last year. So it is clearly that we need to address the sustainable challenges, and a lot of the adversity that we experience and that requires us and the organizations to become more resilient are driven by these challenges and these behaviors. And you may also be familiar with the term VUCA, which is the term with which this century is also being described. And you might know that VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And so what this means is that the the volatility, we have unpredictable behaviors. Things are no longer predictable. With the uncertainty means that the outcomes are often unknown. It is really difficult to predict. With the complexity, it is that the large number of parts that are interacting in unpredictable, difficult to understand ways. And if you just think about the adversity, the 3 effects of adversity I mentioned earlier about the economic crisis, the environmental crisis, and the social crisis with the Lehman Brothers collapse, with the volcano eruption, and with COVID, they are highly complex interactions that are happening there, and it's very difficult to control because we really can't pin it down and take it apart, look at it, and then put it back together. That's the essence of complexity. And of course, the last one, the ambiguity, means that things can have more than one meaning. And so that makes it also quite challenges to engage with them. But so these are the contextual factors that I think make it necessary for us as individuals and more so organizations to become more resilient. That is one reason why resilience is so much more important in the 21st century than it has ever been before. I believe there's also a second one, and that has got much more to do with business trajectories. What do I mean by that? I think there are certain patterns of behavior that have been dominant in most businesses for most of the time. First and foremost is serving shareholders, which is generally leading to very short-term behavior. Yet I also like to raise the question, is that really enough in the future? Is just focusing on shareholders enough? Particularly when we're looking at what is happening in the investment community, where we can find that the US-based Sustainable Investment Foundation reports that the investment that considers sustainability aspects has grown by 42% in 2 years and is expected to continue further. And so we really need to start looking beyond short-term returns for shareholders and find different ways of making our business a success, or defining success for our business. The second trajectory that most businesses are on for most of the time are the focus on cost cutting and efficiencies. And that manifests in things such as outsourcing and offshoring, but I believe it also is reflected in people being treated like numbers. And yet, this focus on cost cutting and efficiencies and treating people like numbers relies on certain assumptions, on certain preconditions. I'd just like to share a few of them. The first one is that nature's resources remain free. Yet, if we are thinking about the fact that there are now more plastic parts than fish in our water, and just to throw some figures at you, there are 25 trillion macro and 51 trillion micro particles littering our oceans. And it's not only the water, also the way we treat the earth. 33% of the Earth's soil are already degraded. And it is expected that by 2050, that figure will rise to 90, that's 90%. And of course, the pollution of the air. And it is known that at least 7 million people every year die through a consequence of air pollution, which is 15 times more than people die from war and violence. Another assumption that underlies the second trajectory is that we expect the transport routes to remain open. We expect trade to flow freely. Yet I'm sure some of you will remember of the freighter Evergreen that in March blocked the Suez Canal. And again, to share some figures, it was the German's insurer Allianz showed that the blockage was costing global trade between $6 to $10 billion a week. And another analysis by an organization, by a broker called Bremer ACM, said that the cost of shipping cargo from Asia and the Middle East had jumped by 47%, by 47%. And I don't know whether any of you are engaged in home improvement projects or building projects. If you are, you will have probably noticed that many building materials, the cost for many building materials, particularly wood and steel, has gone up quite significantly. And this trajectory also assumes that there is ample access to all necessary resources. And again, in recent days, we have experienced or heard quite a lot about the chip shortage that is also connected to the transportation problem, but not only that. And so, we need to think differently about the resources that we use, how we use them, and whether we might be able to think about some alternatives. I'd also just like to mention that many of the rare earth and the rare raw materials that particularly the technical industry relies on are coming from countries such as China, Russia, or even the Congo. Not the most stable political environments, I would think. And then finally, I think another thing that we should consider when we believe that the focus on cost and efficiency and treating people like numbers is one that we can continue on, especially in the United States. You might have heard about the Great Resignation that is currently happening. And according to Microsoft 2021 Work Trend Index, more than 40% of the global workforce were considering quitting their jobs. And there's another survey by PricewaterhouseCoopers that was published in early August that where the figure is even 65%. So employees are voting with their feet. And so it is not surprising that 88% of executives said that their companies were experiencing higher than usual turnover. So really something to think about. You know, the trajectories most organizations or many organizations are on, how sustainable are they? And there's a third one, which is the habit of expecting the sequence, plan, execute, plan to work, i.e. part of the assumptions behind the assumption behind that is that the past will enable us to predict the future. And yet, again, if you're thinking about the five things that have shaped the context of the 21st century and look back to last century, you probably can say that in the last century, yes, there were always changes, but the changes were taking much longer to materialize. And so it was like a gentle curve. And so wherever you are on this curve, if you just look forward and back a little bit, it looks like a linear trajectory. And so also these predictions based on the past were fairly reliable. Yet if you think what is happening in this century, it looks very different. And there is no way that you can think that you can predict the future based on what has happened in the past. And then the final trajectory, or you could also call it frame of mind or dominant logic or whatever you want, is the fact that competition is generally valued over collaboration. And it seemed to have been mostly about maximizing the monetary value extracted from customers and suppliers. So if we look at the context of the 21st century and the trajectories, the customary trajectories that businesses are on, you will find that the demand, the necessity for resilience is driven up by the contextual factors in our century, whereas the behavior of the organizations means their ability to resist, their ability to develop resilience has been going down. So what does becoming resilient actually mean? First of the things that I think is really important, and that is about high time we learn, is that we need to start planning more for the future. We cannot just take from the present without considering on how future generations are supposed to live. And I mean, my mind always boggles when I realize that the Earth Overshoot Day, the day where humanity's demands on ecological resources and services in a given year exceed what Earth can regenerate in a year. And that date this year fell on the 29th of July, which means since the 29th of July, we have been borrowing from the future. We have been borrowing from our children. So if we are to become more resilient, we really need to take needs of future generations into account. And so if we've got a footprint that takes up 160% of what Earth has to offer, we might be better advised to take the wisdom of the Iroquois, who make decisions based on the consequences for 7 generations hence. So thinking about the future, planning for the future, is the first thing that supports the development of resilience. The second one, which really goes against the desire for efficiency, is that you need to have a certain amount of slug in the system. Like with these shock absorbers, if you don't have the shock absorbers and you just smack to the ground, you break. You need something to soften the blow when it comes so that you can recover, that you can bounce back. And one way to do that, one way that really helps build slug into the system, even build abundance, is diversity. And I just think we know from monocultures in agriculture that they are not sustainable. They are not sustainable. They the soil becomes useless. The good soil is being carried away by the wind. We need tons of pesticides and insecticides to get anything out of the ground. And we also know that if we have a diverse context, it nurtures each other. You don't need many insecticides and pesticides in a highly diverse natural context. And In a way, it's very similar for organizations. If you've got a great deal of diversity, you will be much better able to react to a change in the system than if everyone thinks the same, everyone is the same. And also connected to that, in 2018, McKinsey reported that diverse companies are 33% more likely to have greater financial returns than their less diverse industry peers. And another study by the Boston Consulting Group reported that companies with above average diversity at the management level generate 19% higher innovation revenues. So clearly it is highly beneficial to be diverse. Another thing that we also need to do if we want to become resilient is to think in systems and learn to detect weak signals. And of those of you who are familiar with the complexity theory might have heard about the butterfly effect. And for me, it is, detecting weak signals is about detecting the butterfly in the system whose top of the wing will have a big impact on the rest of the system. And fortunately, due to the development of technology and artificial intelligence, whereas in the past we were able to describe what has happened and maybe diagnose why it had happened, in today's world, we are starting to be able to predict and possibly even start to prescribe what is going to happen. And so we don't need clairvoyance to see around the corner. Technology and AI will facilitate that for us. Another aspect is adaptivity. And again, you might be familiar with the quote from Charles Darwin when he said, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one that is most adaptable to change." And that exactly is what resilience is about. Resilience is the ability to be able to cope and respond positively to change. And then the final thing that supports the development of resilience is distributed decision making. And I'd like to borrow from a lovely lady who used to be at Philips, who described the shift as one from pyramids to pancakes. I really love that. And so basically means having much flatter structures. And at this point, I'd just like to come back briefly to the slide I shared at the outset, which about the change of pace that is accelerating. And I don't know whether you noticed that one line is picked out in red, and just to show, pick it out a little bit stronger, I've added this arrow. And that line is the leadership assumptions, i.e. the assumptions we make what leadership is supposed to do and be and how they are supposed to behave. And the interesting thing is, whereas the system goes on an exponential curve, the leadership assumptions thus merrily continue into the distance. And of course, they are all part of one system. And what happens if the system moves in one direction and one aspect moves in the different one? Well, very clearly, it is a disconnect. And so what we need is distributed decision making, which means that leaders need to learn to delegate, to empower, no longer to control. The control and command culture is entirely inappropriate. And if you think again back of the fact that the 21st century is also described through the VUCA context, it's quite interesting to know that the term VUCA came up from the military when the military saw increasing guerrilla tactics. So rather than face to face or direct warfare, it was this were the guerrilla tactics that they were encountering, which were unpredictable and difficult to react to because it was impossible to be in all the places at the same time. And you can only properly react to that if leadership is distributed. If you want to go up the chain of command and come down again, they are all dead. It's too late. You need to be able to have people who can make decisions in that moment. And I'd like to close with two stories to illustrate a little bit better what I mean by this distributed decision making, by this different new way of leadership. And the first one, I had the great pleasure of meeting the conductor, author, and very engaging speaker, Benjamin Zander, who is the director of the Boston Philharmonics. And he told the story when he had a shift in mindset what his leadership was all about. And that was triggered by a piece of research by Harvard into job satisfaction of a number of different professions. And he was very delighted to see that players of a string quartet were right at the top of the scale. They were the happiest, most satisfied people in the world of work. And then he looked further, and then, to his dismay, he found that players of the orchestra were right at the bottom of the scale, even below prison guards and street cleaners. And really, fantastic for him, he realized that, well, hang on a second, the major difference between a string quartet and an orchestra is me, is the conductor. And he actually he said that he really felt quite intoxicated at times, waving his wand about, and at times hundreds of people would follow his every move, until he realized, well, actually, maybe I should think about what my contribution to the orchestra is, not what the orchestra's contribution for me is. And so this move towards what is also goes in the direction of servant leadership, if you're familiar with that term. And I think there's even a step further. And again, it is a composer that triggered that thought in me, and that is Sir Simon Rattle, at the time the conductor of the Berliner Philharmonic. And there's a lovely video that accompanies the Berliner Philharmonic on a tour to Asia. And at some point, I watched with great intrigue, the orchestra was playing, and Simon Rattle left the conductor podium and went into the auditorium, sat down. And the orchestra was playing just so accurately, beautifully, intensely, emotionally. It was really incredible without him being there. And so it was because every one of the players understood the vision for how the music was supposed to be performed, i.e. understood the vision. Every musician had the skills to perform his or her part. Every musician was willing to take the responsibility, and every musician was really willing to put their contribution for the greater good of the orchestra. And that, I think, is already one step further. And if everyone has a deep understanding of what an organization wants to achieve, if they have the skill and the will to make decision, then the role of the leader is to provide the context and support, and to provide the vision and make sure the skills are available, and then maybe just stand back. And so I think that a lot of happening in the workplace already that supports the path towards greater resilience. I think it is becoming more aware of these different things that are possible and engaging, and also just understanding that the context in which we operate in this century truly is very different from what we have experienced before. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Bettina. Thank you so much for that review of such an important topic. I think that I is looking through the comments and the questions from the audience. It's an area that resonates with so many. So I'm going to ask you to bring your camera back on very well, and then go and stop showing your screen so that the audience can see us in the big screen. Excellent, very, very well. So lots of different questions and themes. We have about 6 minutes left here, and I want to explore the most common themes from the presentation. Thank you so much again for sharing the research, the insights related to resilience. One of the questions, and maybe it's a bit of a bias. We look at past generations, and I'll personalize and even say I look at my great-grandparents. I was like, boy, those are resilient people. And it's like, I'm not as resilient as my great-grandparents. And I don't know if we look back a few generations, if people feel more or less resilient than their predecessors. Do you feel that over time, and maybe looking at the last 200 years or so specifically, that generations have become more or less resilient? And is that something that we can even assess?
That is a wonderful question. I almost want to say that perhaps we develop resilience only in the face of adversity. And so, you know, the less we are threatened, the less we are challenged, the more comfortable and pleasant we become. And, you know, so I think this is also why I believe that the organizations, whether it is organization, I think the same is true for individuals in this context, right? You know, we as individuals need to become more resilient if we want to deal with all that is being thrown at us at the moment. But you know, the fact that we seem to rise to the challenge also makes me quite hopeful that organizations will be able to embrace it, especially if we look, you know, how we can learn from. Well, I am always a very strong believer in learning from nature. I think it's almost anything we want to understand, anything we want to learn. There are examples in nature that really help us to get there quicker than trying it on our own.
For sure. Another thing that has emerged goes back into what you're just discussing. Is this the discussion between nature versus nurture when it comes to a lot of traits, including resilience being one of them? Curious about your research on resilience. How much of resilience is codified in our DNA versus developed through experiences with adversity and learning through that to higher levels of resistance? I think we all agree that there is a component on both. But is there any research that identifies how much of it is nature versus nurture?
I have looked more at the organizational levels than the individual ones. And I mean, I can only say that I also find it really fascinating. And if you look at siblings, you sometimes find that one sibling is very resilient and very resourceful and very well able to cope with any kind of adversity, whereas the other one might not. And you just think, well, you've grown up in a, while not the same, but in a similar context. So how is that? I do think, though, that it does have a lot to do with education and parenting. So if I bring my children up, you know, if we are coming to a crossing and my child wants to go across, and I just hold it back and say, no, stop, and then say, now you can go. You know, they will always rely on me to do that for them. But if we're coming to the junction and I say to my child, is it safe to go? Can we go now? Then they will learn in a very different way to assess possible dangers, to look out for dangers, to, you know, to rely more on themselves and their judgment and their decision making. And I think that is something like that contributes to greater resilience.
Very well, very well. Another comment that came up was related to and in organizational settings. It seems that people are more sensitive than they used to be. I mean, you can say something, you know, passing that, and I'm not talking about anything controversial, that people are triggered by smaller things than they used to be. Seems like. Is that true, or is that just a bias that we have? Or is that true? Have you experienced that in organizations, that we are perhaps a little bit more fragile and a little bit more sensitive to everything around us? Maybe we are becoming overwhelmed about all that's going on in the world.
I absolutely agree that we do become overwhelmed. I think it's a lot of decisions are based on fear and a lack of understanding. And you know, lack of understanding always triggers fear. If we don't understand something, we become afraid of it. You know, because we just, you know, we don't know what it means. And I think this is making people more fragile and more reactive, being triggered more easily. Absolutely.
And following up on that, Bettina, what do you say about people who are in organizations right now and they feel that they have a need to, we all have a need to become more resilient. That's something I don't know if you ever become, you know, at the top level of resilience, that you don't need to become more resilient. There is always a bigger challenge out there that's going to test your resilience. So the question is, whatever level I'm at, what are some of the things that I can do at work, in the work environment, and maybe personally that will help me on the work environment to become a more resilient professional specifically? How do I become a more resilient professional?
Well, actually, the first thing that came into my mind is to be authentic. Because if we are not authentic, the energy we spend on putting the mask on and keeping the mask up, we can use much better in, becoming stronger inside and becoming more resilient. And I think to have the courage to be authentic, to have the self-belief, to have, I think mostly it seems to be courage. For people just to say, well, this is who I am and what I am, and also, none of us is perfect. We all are afraid of something, and we don't have to present the perfect facade. By the way, this is why I don't mind, having my real background in the background rather than an artificial one. This is part of me, and it's I'm comfortable with that. I don't have a problem sharing that. And I find it much better than part of me disappearing in some of the backgrounds that I've seen other people use. Half of them disappears. I'm just saying, no, come back. And so I think this authenticity, and again, I think COVID in a way has made us all a little bit more human. Children barging into a conference call, or the dog barking, or the postman ringing at the door. It just shows us that we are all facing the same challenges, struggling with the same issues. And I think also when we are able to talk about it, when we are able to share it, some of the fear can go away, and so it can give us more strength and make us a little bit more resilient if we don't feel alone with our concerns and fears.
Absolutely. Real courage is born out of vulnerability, and that's a very important concept. Bettina, I can't believe we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for sharing this very important message of our global audience, that we internalize and become more resilient as a result of this findings and perspectives. And I want to deep thanks to you for sharing the research and your insights with our global audience today.
Thank you very much. It was my great pleasure indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Bettina van Stamm, directly from Munich in Germany, sharing the importance of resilience for the organizations, professionals, and citizens of the 21st century. So thank you so much for that. This wraps up day one of Enterprise Architecture Europe Live. There are many things that you can do between now and tomorrow, including checking out the posting under LinkedIn under my name for Enterprise Architecture Europe Live, and you can make comments, questions, thank our speakers. You have a list of all speakers in there hyperlinked so that you can connect with them with one click, and you can certainly ask questions under the comments for the session, for the conference. I'm going to be posting a quick update and thanking all of our sponsors, thanking all our speakers, and thanking all of you who have engaged so intentionally, so collaboratively in these sessions. I appreciate all the questions that you have asked and all the feedback that you provide. I look forward to meeting you tomorrow at the same channel. I want to give you a quick preview of who is presenting tomorrow. We have a wonderful day with cross-industry leaders of enterprise architecture coming to us. We're going to kick it off at the same time as we did today with Raul Lode, who is the Senior Director of SAP Artificial Intelligence, and he's going to talk about strategies for enterprise artificial intelligence adoption. We're gonna then move on to healthcare with Scott Whitmire. Scott Whitmire is a leader at the Mayo Clinic. He's a research leader and systems architect at the Mayo Clinic, and he's going to talk specifically the enterprise architect as a troubleshooter. Just think about what happened yesterday with Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Some enterprise architect was troubleshooting that. And, imagine the pressure. How do they go about doing it? And Scott Whitmire is going to go into the details on how great enduring organizations and leaders do that. We're going to then migrate to another fantastic speaker, a leader of enterprise architecture at the Mars Wrigley and Company. And this is Satish Kamath, who's going to talk to us about the incredible journey of culture, business, and digital transformation that's happening at Mars, and not the planet. This is the oldest joke they hear about all the time. It is the company, this amazing company that is undergoing a tremendous transformation for value creation. And we're going to wrap up tomorrow with another leader coming out from biopharmaceuticals. And we're talking about Nilesh Ajmani, who is the lead enterprise architect, senior data scientist serving Biogen. And Nilesh is going to finish the sessions tomorrow. As you can see, heavy on real great enterprise architects and leaders across multiple industries. So I hope you can join us at this same channel at the same time. Wherever you are in the world, have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you back tomorrow. Bye-bye for now.